A while ago, I made an FE6 tier list. It was pretty contentious, but most FE6 tier lists are, and I do stand by the majority of the rankings that I had. However, there is one character who I wanted to revisit because I got a lot of comments about how I was drastically underrating her utility. I placed her in low C tier because while she can be a second Rutger, many armies don't require a second Rutger. Rutger's biggest contributions occur before Fear joins, and even once Fear joins, she requires some training and the second Hero Crest in order to match Rutger's performance. If you want two Swordmasters going into the mid-game, then Fear is not a bad option. In fact, she is your only option for a second Swordmaster. But at the end of the day, she just becomes another competent infantry unit who you had to invest both experience and a promotion item into. However, I got a good deal of comments talking about how it's actually really easy to train Fear, so we shouldn't penalize her for needing experience. She basically gets to promotion for free on her join map, fighting against the pirates. And Rutger's one of the best units in the game. I mean, I placed him in S tier after all, so why would you not want a second copy of Rutger? Honestly, it was kind of foolish of me to rank Fear so low, when she is so clearly one of the best units in the cast. A while ago, I made an FE6 tier list. It was pretty contentious, but most FE6 tier lists are, and I do stand by the majority of the rankings that I had. However, there is one character who I wanted to revisit because I got a lot of comments about how I was drastically overrating her utility. I placed her in low C tier because while she can be a second Rutger, many armies don't require a second Rutger. Rutger's biggest contributions occur before Fear joins, and even once Fear joins, she requires some training and the second Hero Crest in order to match Rutger's performance. If you want two Swordmasters going into the mid-game, then Fear is not a bad option. In fact, she is your only option for a second Swordmaster. But at the end of the day, she just becomes another competent infantry unit who you had to invest both experience and a promotion item into. However, I got a lot of comments talking about how Fear is actually kind of trash. In my analysis, I mentioned that the best parts of Rutger come before Fear's recruitment, so why would I bother training up a unit who's already missed the opportunity to put those contributions in? The Hero Crest is much better used on Gonzalez or Deke. Heck, even Geese could potentially make use of it, or you could sell the Hero Crest. Money is boots in FE6 after all. Honestly, it was kind of foolish and embarrassing for me to rank Fear as high as I did. A while ago, I made an FE6 tier list. I put Fear in C tier and got a bunch of comments saying that she was either over or underrated. And now I'm sitting here like a filthy centrist, smugly insisting that both sides are wrong and that I'm the only one who understands because I'm so big-brained. Just as a disclaimer, I don't actually think I'm the only person capable of properly analyzing a video game character from 2 decades ago. This is meant to just be a funny bit as an introduction to a deep dive onto Fear, one of the more contentious units in the series. Okay, so for anyone who hasn't played FE6 or just needs a quick refresher, I do want to take a brief moment to look at Fear in a vacuum. I think evaluating units in a vacuum misses a lot of crucial details, but at the very least this gives us somewhere to start from. Fear joins in Chapter 9, which if you're going for the true ending, is the 10th chapter of the game. Due to the hard mode bonuses glitch, she starts with actually decent stats. 25 HP, 9 strength, 12 skill, 13 speed, 5 luck, 4 defense, 2 resistance, and 5 constitution. Fear's speed is probably on pace with the majority of your army, and her strength is slightly below what I would expect the average unit to have during Chapter 9. 12 skill is actually quite good, especially since she uses swords, so she naturally has a higher hit rate anyway. The only stats I'd say are outright bad are her defense and resistance, meaning that she has some bulk issues. However, the thing that makes these stats particularly impressive is that Fear joins as a level 1 unpromoted unit. And normally you would expect a level 1 unit to have much worse stats than these. Granted, having high stats for a level 1 unit isn't something that's good on its own, but the fact that she's only level 1 unpromoted means that she gains experience quite quickly, and as a result, she can take advantage of her kinda decent growth rates. The three most impressive are her 50% skill, 50% luck, and 55% speed. Skill and luck are often looked at as dump stats, but anything that helps hit rates is good in FE6. And since enemies have luck, you want to have a decent amount of luck on most of your units in order to avoid low percentage crit. On the other hand, her 25% strength growth is not great. In fact, it's one of the lowest strength growths in the game. It's lower than Walt, lower than Sue, tied with Marcus. It's not very impressive, okay? In fact, from consulting my local FE6 expert, the only 3 units who have a lower strength growth are Juno, Nime for her magic, and Dayan. Thank you and shoutouts to Wendy Moth for that assistance. It isn't as bad as it seems. 9 is a decent base combat-wise, and she does gain +3 from the Swordmaster promotion, but the fact that her strength growth is so shaky does make the training prospects of Fear questionable. And that goes double for her bulk. 75% HP is nice, but most units in the cast have high HP growths. And when it's coupled with a low defense and resistance growth, it's hard for Fear to stand up to multiple hits. She really has to rely on dodging if she wants to survive on enemy phase. With her naturally high speed and FE6's shaky hit rates, this is definitely feasible, but it's far from ideal. The last thing worth noting is that Fear is a Myrmidon, which means she will promote to Swordmaster. She trades an extra weapon type for a crit bonus, and this is generally not a particularly good trade in my opinion. Despite the fact that, in my opinion, swords are the best weapon in the Binding Blade, the ability to manipulate the weapon triangle does still come with advantages, especially for a unit whose longevity is fairly dependent on dodging. Moreover, despite the fact that FE6 has really lackluster 1-2 range options, it is pretty undeniably better to have access to shitty 1-2 range than no 1-2 range at all. And considering Fear's incredibly high skill growth, she could probably make either hand axes or javelins work if she were able to use them. The main advantage of the crit bonus is being able to stack it with either a critical weapon, critical support, or both in order to have pretty excessively high crit rates. Rutger can pretty famously reach 100% crit if you grind his supports, but personally, I don't think that's the selling point of the crit bonus. Instead, it seems mostly useful as a gamble to kill a problematic enemy, or potentially to free up an extra action if you were planning to chip with Fear and then finish with someone else. In most situations, her crit bonus isn't going to be super reliable, which is why I'm not a huge fan of it, but when it does come in handy, it is helpful, I guess. Worst case scenario, it can make some of the more tedious boss kills into less of a chore than they otherwise would be. The last notable trait about Fear is her starting sword rank of D, which is definitely lower than you would expect for this point in the game, but far from unsalvageable. This is before you have access to purchasable killer weapons, so iron and steel are what the majority of units are going to be using anyway. And while it definitely sucks that Fear can't just grab the killing edge when she needs it, and weapon rank is very slow to build in FE6, Fear is a unit who, if you're using, she's going to be seeing a lot of combat. She requires that training arc anyway, and thus will naturally build some amount of weapon rank. The biggest downside to D-rank swords is that it is possible for Fear to miss the Wormslayer threshold in Chapter 12, but I find that that is unlikely if you are training her. And if you're not training her, you're probably not using her anyway, in which case it doesn't really matter because she's riding the bench. It is also worth noting she joins with the Wu Dao in her inventory, which only herself, Rutger, and Karel can use, since it is locked to Swordmasters and Myrmidons, and so this fairly high quality weapon can help make up for the weapon rank deficiencies, at least in the short term. But looking at a unit in a vacuum can only get us so far. In fact, it's incredibly difficult to look at a unit isolated from their game. I've even referenced some features of FE6 in this analysis, calling into question it being an in a vacuum anyway. So I want to take a look at the game that Fear finds herself in, and since she is often described as a second version of Rutger, I think the best place to start is examining why Rutger is so commonly considered to be a top tier unit. Despite Swordmaster typically being a mediocre class throughout its life in the series, it is not uncommon to see people refer to Rutger as the best unit in the Binding Blade. And while I personally think Marcus holds that title, it's impossible to deny that the edgy Swordmaster at least deserves to be a part of the conversation. Rutger and Fear are often compared to each other, and for good reason. In addition to being the only two Myrmidons you have access to, they have a weird amount in common. Rutger also benefits from hard mode bonuses, elevating his rather decent bases to be quite good both for his level and his join time. Both units specialize in skill and speed, and when combining this stat spread with a weapon that already has naturally high hit, they are very good at getting through the Binding Blade's abysmal hit rates, especially against bosses on Thrones and Gate, which can be particularly problematic. And further lending them towards the role of boss killer is the aforementioned crit bonus. Plus 30 is a big number, and while it's not something you should rely on, if you're seeing a bunch of rounds of combat against the boss anyway, it's probably going to proc once or twice, especially if you're doubling, which high-speed units often will. In fact, their similarities are so extreme that if you take a look at their averages, they tend to have nearly identical stats at every point in their career. Rutger has a little bit more bulk, and Fear has a significantly larger amount of luck, but otherwise, in a vacuum, they are quite close to each other. But that's the problem with looking at units in a vacuum, because there is so much more to Rutger than what I have described. Rutger joins in Chapter 4, about halfway through the map, and he has stats that are actually comparable to Marcus at base, with equal strength and better speed, but worse bulk. Of course, Marcus has the advantage of a horse plus Silver Lance rank, but Rutger is still very good at combat right out of the gate, especially because his weapon rank is also quite good. He joins with C rank swords and a Killing Edge in his inventory. The Killing Edge is iconic for having a crit rate, but in FE6 it serves another function. At 9 might, it is stronger than steel swords but more accurate than them, only having 5 less accuracy than the iron sword itself. The weapon's high might, when combined with Rutger's high strength and speed, means that he can easily double and delete problematic enemies. I think it's best to think of the Killing Edge as Rutger's version of Marcus's Silver Lance. His combat is good without it, but if you really need something dead, you can use the Killing Edge and then it dies. At a point where most of your units need to team up in groups of 2 or 3 just to handle generic scrub, having someone who is competent all on their own is a godsend. And in this way, Marcus, Rutger, and Deke sort of function as the 3 pillars of the early game. Now, much like Fear, Rutger's strength growth is not especially good. It's only 5% higher than her, so he's not going to be getting the gains that you would like, but he will typically gain enough strength to keep pace with enemy bulk. Especially because, since he is more competent than most people around him, Rutger is usually going to be facing more combat. After all, you use your competent units to delete the enemy because the incompetent units struggle to do so. Because he can more easily secure kills, he more readily gets kill EXP and snowballs in that direction. It is worth noting that despite his slow gains in strength and defense, Rutger's skill and speed will routinely shoot through the roof. And those are both stats that are arguably more important in the Binding Blade. You can fix low damage output with stronger weapons, but there's only so far you can go to fix accuracy with more accurate weapons, considering how inaccurate most of the weapons in the Binding Blade are. This accuracy is especially important versus early game bosses. People like to emphasize Henning, but really anyone who's standing on a gate or throne is difficult to hit. But because of how much Rutger excels above the competition in killing bosses, there has been a recent wave of backlash labeling him as just a boss killer, and questioning whether he deserves his revered status. Personally, I think this is a little bit silly because if you're good at killing bosses, you are also good at killing non-bosses, and Rutger's combat even at base is phenomenal. Just as a easy point of comparison, Lance, who is frequently considered to be a good unit, needs to reach somewhere between level 12 and 14 to have stats on par with Rutger's base stats. That's not to say the edgelord is flawless, lack of amount hurts a little bit, and every unit would appreciate some access to 1-2 range that isn't the light brand, but considering just how underwhelming javelins and hand axes are in this game, I would much prefer to have sword access than 1-2 range access. Both is of course better, but if I had to choose one, I'm choosing swords every day of the week. Despite these drawbacks though, I don't want to understate Rutger's early game performance. It is phenomenal. And as you move into the mid-game, Rutger continues to keep pace with the rest of your army. But his drawbacks start to show little by little more and more. Whoever your chosen paladin is will likely have combat close to Rutger's level. Shauna, Milady, and Tate gaining sword access or accuracy from killer lances also makes Rutger's niche stand out a little bit less. And as your anima sages get better, you have more options for accuracy against dodgy enemies. Rutger is still one of your best boss killers, and he's able to hold his own on the battlefield, but his time as the de facto second best unit in your army is likely sunsetting. And this is the background we are in as we recruit Fear in Chapter 9. Getting a second Rutger at this time isn't a terrible proposition, as he isn't fully expired. I mean, heck, not even all of the factors I listed, such as Tate and Milady, have even shown up. But Fear's ability to roughly replicate the Scarlet Swordsman isn't necessarily the slam dunk argument that her proponents seem to feel it is. Especially since this comes at the cost of a training arc. With that in mind, I do want to take a close look at her training arc. As previously mentioned, Fear joins about halfway through Chapter 9, which is the start of the Western Isles arc. The Western Isles is often presented as a series of breather maps after the especially grueling early game of FE6. And as a result of this, it has the reputation of being the best arc to train your lower level units, especially any of the units that have sword availability, since many of the enemies in the Western Isles are axe units. But over the past year, I've begun to question just how accurate this description of the Western Isles is. Sure, Chapter 9 fits that to a T, with plenty of weak enemies and a lot of pirate reinforcements, but once you get into the route split, the difficulty starts to ramp up. If we take a look at A route, Chapter 10A is not the most grueling map in the world, but it has its fair share of difficult enemies, including some mercenaries that can be very threatening with their killer weapons. Sure, this map does feature a series of pirate reinforcements that you can feed to any training project you wish, but they are flanked by a ballista, which makes it more difficult to position yourself to take advantage of the pirates. Meanwhile, Chapter 11A is one of the busier maps in the game, especially if you want to get all of the side objectives. There are 3 recruitable units, each of which you want to move pretty quickly to get towards, and a whole bunch of villages that need saving. The enemy makeup is also almost entirely non-axe units. Sure, there are some bandit reinforcements towards the end of the map, but you're mostly going to be fighting against archers and cavaliers. Crucially, however, the most difficult portion of this map is not the combat, but the movement, and so being an infantry unit, Fear is at a natural disadvantage. I do typically deploy 1 or 2 infantry for this map, but there are plenty of infantry more suited for the task than Fear. Rutger's combat is almost certainly better than Fear's at this point. Anyone who can use the Brave Act is going to be good at breaking the wall, and mages with access to accurate 2 range are better at fighting archers than a sword-locked unit would be. But the majority of units I'm deploying in Chapter 11 are going to be on mounts of some kind. Shauna can help drop people over the wall, and anyone on a horse can rush down to try to recruit Klein and Echidna. This is also the first map where you have access to a dancer, and as a result, rescue dropping is even more valuable than normal, as utilizing it to its fullest extent can keep her on pace with the rest of your army. If we look at the B route of the route split, things are even more dire for potential training projects. 10B is a slightly remixed version of 11A, so most of the points I made for Chapter 11A apply here as well. There is no dancer, but rescue dropping is still nice. Especially since if you want to recruit Gonzalez, you're going to need to get Lilina to the opposite side of the map from where you start. Additionally, there's a motivation to bring one of either Lot or Wade here to get better rewards from the villages, so you're already taking up 2 slots with infantry units that you might not otherwise deploy. One for Lilina and the other for the warrior of your choice. Other than that, this is just a really big map for cavalry. Chapter 11B does feature a good amount of axe enemies for Fear to fight against, but it also has a long ballista covering the entire map, which means deploying anyone frail is a little bit of a risky proposition. Fear's defenses are not super up to snuff, and while she probably isn't getting one-shot by the ballista, she's definitely not wanting to get hit by it. And the same applies to any other training projects you might have. Additionally, because of the barter recruitment, this is another map where you really value movement at a premium. That being said, because Fear can recruit barter, this is technically an upside for her. Roy can recruit barter as well, so she's not mandatory to deploy here, but it does mean that Roy has more flexibility with where to go and how to stay out of ballista range. So that is upside that I want to acknowledge. It doesn't super help with the training arc, but if she's already partially trained, this can be a good bit of utility for her. But moving on to Chapter 12, which is the climax of the Western Isles arc, this is another map that I wouldn't say is particularly good for training people, but especially not sword-locked people. You're on a timer here, and there are a series of treasure chests as side objectives you want to reach, so movement is already at a bit of a premium. But the nail in the coffin is the majority of enemies on this map have access to 2 range. The gimmick is running through hallways where archers can take pot shots at you over the wall with iron bows and longbows. This is a very big map for your bow users like Sue, Shin, and Klein to have their time in the spotlight. Meanwhile, anyone who's locked to 1 range is kind of struggling. Javelins and hand axes are bad, but at least they have a 45% chance of hitting the archers. Fear's Iron Sword has a 0% chance. Moreover, this is a map with some very threatening enemies. If you haven't finished your training arc at this point, this is not a good place to continue it. Snipers, warriors, just all sorts of scary stuff. There is a Mana-Keep boss, so anyone with sword access can use the Wormslayer, but Fear is far from the only sword user in your army. With all that being said, Chapter 12X is another breather map, and it's a good place to train up units that you want to invest in. But with such limited deployment slots, you do kind of have to be picky about who you're training, especially since you probably want to deploy at least one of your thieves, given the large number of stealables and treasure chests on this map. After this, you move on to Chapter 13, which is where you start getting access to powerful pre-promotes, like Milady, who's not technically promoted but feels like it, and shortly thereafter Cecilia, Igrin, and Percival. So if a training project hasn't gotten off the ground by the time you leave the Western Isles, they're probably not getting off the ground for the rest of the game. But looking at the Western Isles on the whole, it doesn't feel like the free EXP for training projects that it is often presented as. Instead, I think the pair of chapters that work for a more reasonable training arc are Chapter 8X and Chapter 9. We've already discussed why Chapter 9 is a fairly easy map to train on, but Chapter 8X is arguably even easier. There's no time pressure, and a large number of the enemies are stationary, meaning that anyone who has access to 2 range can safely chip away and get free experience. And it kind of makes sense from a game design perspective for these to be the breather maps, as Chapters 6, 7, and 8 give you a large number of units who demand EXP to be useful. I've made an entire video about Sue, but the TLDR is she joins underleveled in a very good class, and has decent enough growths to be a useful member of the team if you're willing to invest in her. Trek and Noah are often presented as replacement units for Alan and Lance, and I would agree with this assessment, but they need EXP to be up to snuff. So if you want them to replace your fallen Christmas calves, you're going to have to give them EXP in the training maps. And in Chapter 8, you get both Ogier and Lilina, who show up with a similar proposition. They are underleveled versions of units you already have, with a slightly different growth set. Ogier has somewhat more speed than Deke, And Lilina has higher magic and a free Roy support in exchange for less speed. There's also Wendy, who is largely a joke unit, but if you want to use her, you do need to train her, and she joins right before 2 training maps, so I'll lump her in with them. Crucially, all of these units also have the tools to make use of the Easy EXP in chapters 8X and 9. Sue, Lilina, and the Cavs have 2 range to take advantage of the stationary enemies. And considering 8X doesn't even unlock if Lilina is dead, it feels pretty explicit that they were designed to be yum-yum food for her. Meanwhile, Ogier and the Cavs have sword access, meaning that they can take advantage of the low accuracy of Chapter 9's pirate reinforcements. Wendy doesn't really fall into either of these categories. She's got javelin access like the Cavs, but she'll be even less accurate than them. And her bulk is so low that one-ranging the pirates at weapon triangle disadvantage is a losing proposition. Unless you were using her for favoritism or meme reasons, I don't think Wendy is competing with Fear over the EXP. And if we're being honest, a similar thing applies to Ogier. But Lilina and the replacement Cavs absolutely are. Depending on your team composition, you might want access to a high-power, high-accuracy mage, or additional Cavaliers. Yeah, Trek and Noah probably aren't getting the Night Crest unless Alan and Lance bit the dust, but on the large number of movement-intensive maps coming up, having another filler Cavalier, even just for the short term, is not the worst thing in the world. Similarly, Sue is a very useful unit if you're willing to invest in her. She has opportunities for experience earlier than Chapter 9, but she still might appreciate level ups on the Western Isles. And even if you're not feeding her, there is another Nomad that joins alongside Fear who is one of the best units in the game. And part of this is because he also starts underleveled with very high stats. Shin isn't level 1, but at level 5 he will be gaining experience at a very fast rate. And yeah, he doesn't have weapon triangle over the pirates, but he can attack them uncountered. If I'm slowing down to grind up anyone who I recruited on Chapter 9, it's going to be Shin. He just has a much better return on investment than Fear does. And make no mistake, having Fear fight all of the pirates on her drawing mat is a form of investment. Even if you're like me and you don't care about the turns that it takes, those are enemies that would be easy for anyone you want to raise to kill. Using them to get yourself a second accurate sword infantry member, or third if we're counting Echidna, is a valid option if you feel that's what your team needs. But a powerful Nomad, a highly accurate anima user, or a filler Cavalier are also valid options, again, depending on your preference and your team composition. My point isn't that Fear doesn't give you a good return on investment, but simply that she is not the only person competing for that investment, and almost every option will give you a good return. Although on the topic of investing in Fear, there is one other piece of investment that I want to talk about, and that is the second Hero Crest. Fire Emblem 6 gives you 2 early Hero Crests, one in Chapter 7 and one on the Western Isles. You can also purchase additional Hero Crests in the Chapter 15 secret shop, or steal one from the final boss of the bad ending, but for the most part, you are limited to promoting 2 Hero Crest users within a reasonable time frame. The majority of people default to giving Rutger the first Hero Crest, and while there are other people vying for it, I think for the most part, Rutger makes a better case than his direct competition. That leaves us with only 1 Hero Crest to work with, and a bunch of possible candidates for promotion with it. If you're going to use Fear, she basically needs it. There's not really a reason to train a training project only to not promote them. So I want to see what we're missing out on by investing the crest in her rather than her competition. The first and perhaps most obvious candidate is Deke. He has a lot of traits in common with Rutger, joining early with very good stats for the time and being sword locked, but that not being a bad thing in FE6. Instead of the 30% crit bonus, on promotion, Deke gets access to axes. For the most part, I think he's going to want to stick to swords. He only has 12 base skill with a 40% growth, which isn't terrible, but usually isn't enough to make up for the abysmal hit rates on hand axes. But, as I've been saying throughout this video, it's better to have the option than not. Even if you only counter enemy archers 45% of the time with a hand axe, you counter them 0% of the time with a steel sword. Still, his accuracy is noticeably worse than both of the Myrmidons, although this isn't his biggest flaw in my opinion. The thing that causes Deke to show his age is his shaky speed growth. He has a base of 10, which is quite nice for the time he joins, but a growth of 30%, which as a level 5 unit is just not good enough to keep up. Even factoring in the 2 he gets from promoting to hero, I find that Deke often fails to hit doubling thresholds and sometimes even gets doubled himself if I try to drag him along through the mid-game. Ogier sort of presents himself as the counter-argument to this. He has a 15% higher speed growth, which isn't much but can be enough to sometimes make him hit thresholds that Deke doesn't. But he's also a low-level training project who joins alongside other potentially better training projects, so I'm not a huge fan of spending Hero Crest on him. If I want to make someone into a hero, it's probably going to be Deke. And the biggest factor in motivating me to give him the second crest is early speed level ups. If he gets blessed, he's probably making the squad. If not, Echidna will take his place instead. The other 2 early game Hero Crest users are Lot and Wade, your only 2 fighters of the cast. This is probably going to disappoint some people, but I'm not a fan of either of these units. They can do some unreliable chip or gamble with the halberd and hammer in the early game, but beyond that, I'm not terribly sold. Axes are kind of trash in the Binding Blade. The biggest upside to making one into a warrior is you get bow access on a high strength unit, which is certainly a good selling point. Bows are a very good weapon type in FE6 after all, but much like with the heroes, you get a warrior as a pre-promote option. Granted, you have to choose between Barter and Echidna, but if you're really in the market for a high-strength bow unit and Su and Shin won't suffice, going B route on the Western Isles is a viable option. I think Barter's a better unit than people give him credit for. Your other potential options are the Berserkers. Geese is pretty trash, but Gonzalez is a unit that I like quite a lot. He hits hard and has the speed to double, and is generally bulky enough to take quite a few hits. His biggest 2 downsides are the fact that he's stuck using axes, which are shit and don't help his accuracy whatsoever, and the fact that he's so heavy it is hard to carry him around with horse-mounted or flying units. Depending on the route you go on, Gonzalez does have the option to instant promote, so the selling point behind him is mostly that he doesn't need a training arc. Although on a route where he joins underleveled, I think that he's probably a worse project than Fear. Neither of them are unusable, but he joins in Chapter 10, so no longer in the easy training arc, and axes are significantly worse than swords, both as a starting point and a finish point. So looking at it, Fear appears to be generally one of the better users of the second Hero Crest. Although there is theoretically another good user of the Hero Crest, and that's Anna if you sell it to her to get boots money. Okay, this isn't a user, but there is an argument that if they're not using any of the Hero Crest units long term, it might be worth more as gold than it is as a promotion item. I don't necessarily think it's specifically worth building your team in such a way to not use the Hero Crest just for this reason. But if you don't feel inclined to put any of the Hero Crest users on your team, selling it for boots money isn't the worst decision in the world. Still, at the end of the day, I don't think giving the Hero Crest to Fear should be held against her, since most units in your army want a promotion item at this time, and there's not really anyone who stands out as specifically being a better user of the crest than her. So all of that brings us back to the question that initially began this video. Did I underrate Fear? Did I overrate her? Or did I rate her appropriately? And the answer, as unsatisfying as it is it depends on your perspective. Personally, I'm leaving her where she is, because I feel that within my criteria, as well as the ways I like to play, she ends up as a C tier unit. I penalize her for the training cost, because while it doesn't take turns, it does absolutely soak up experience. And personally, I don't think the payoff is worth that. But if you're a huge fan of the accurate sword girl, then add her to your team. Maybe you'll rate her higher than I did as a result. From what I understand, the consensus among the LTC community is that she's pretty good, because Rutger is a huge part of that game if you care about reliability. And she's the only unit who can replicate his level of reliability within the turn floors that they're going for. But if you have less of a concern about turns, there are other people who can fill that niche. Heck, if you're willing to support grind, then Lilina can fill that niche very well. Although she is yet another unit that needs some of that yummy 8x and 9 experience. If you only leave this video with one takeaway, I would hope it's that the Chapter 9 pirates are not free. If you care about turns, they cost a bunch of that, and if you don't care about turns, it's a highly competitive experience. Yes, Fear can benefit from it, but so can other units, and that makes it not free. But you know what else isn't free? Bills! Which is why I am eternally grateful for the people who financially support me on Patreon. So, thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Reflect, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Queen Eliza, Adele, Thaythom, Andu, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Belwenska, Dysyke, Josh Jingle, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Controlled Aegis, Joanna the Wrenchwitch, Ginger, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey and Julia Kyoto. If you are interested in supporting the channel for as little as $3 a month, you'll gain access to early videos, as well as polls that influence which characters I make videos on. Fear was actually the winner of one such poll. But please, only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Free ways to support the channel are things like liking, subscribing, and commenting down below. If you made it this far in the video, comment with the code word Lance Reaver so I know you listened to the whole thing. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.